Greetings. Today I want to talk about some of the interesting historical places of southeastern Indiana. I will use the historical markers located around the region as a reference point. My book, Southeast Indiana Day Trips from my Road Trip Indiana series, includes every historical marker installed by the Indiana Historical Bureau in the region. In the book, I include the text of the marker as well as some background information to give the marker more context. Historical markers, ignored by many, can give some interesting insights into the events, people, and places of a city, town, or village. Many of the topics of the markers are not well known. We will begin our tour in Clark County at the Falls of the Ohio State Park and the beginning of the Lewis and Clark expedition that lasted from 1803 until 1806. The marker is located at 1200 South Harrison Street, Clarksville, in Clark County. Marker text, quote, near this site on October the 26th, 1803, Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, with the nucleus of the Corps of Discovery together, set off down the Ohio River on their epic journey to explore the Louisiana Purchase and Pacific Northwest, unquote. William Clark lived with his brother, George Rogers Clark, in this cabin near the Ohio River when he received the letter from Meriwether Lewis requesting that he become co-commander of the expedition into the vast Louisiana Territory. The cabin became the base camp for Lewis and Clark as they organized the expedition. The Corps of Discovery breathed into life in the cabin as the men recruited other men from Indiana, Kentucky, and Virginia to make the historic journey west. Meriwether Lewis arrived at the Falls of the Ohio on October the 14th, 1803. The Clark homesite is located within the bounds of Falls of the Ohio State Park in Clarksville. The historic marker is near the cabin where the men planned the operation. President Thomas Jefferson requested that Congress fund an expedition into his newly acquired territory. His instructions to Lewis and Clark were, quote, the object of your mission is to explore the Missouri River and such principal streams, it as by its course and communication with the waters of the Pacific Ocean, whether the Columbia, Oregon, Colorado, or other river may offer the most direct and practical water communication across this continent for the purpose of commerce, unquote. He also wanted to establish the new republic's presence in the vast territory. France, Great Britain, and Spain all had intense interest in the region, and that Jefferson wanted to make the United States claim valid with his exploratory mission. Other goals included discovering the sort of natural resources the region had and making contact with the various native tribes that inhabited the region. It was also his hope that they would find a water route across the continent. Lewis had served President Jefferson as his personal secretary. As such, he gained access to Jefferson's vast library to study the maps, books, and other information Jefferson had acquired. He consulted with Jefferson and gleaned whatever scientific information he needed for the expedition. He studied medicine for a time with noted physician Benjamin Rush. The president also asked astronomer Andrew Ellicott to teach Lewis how to use various navigational aids like the sextant. Jefferson chose Lewis because, in his words, quote, it was impossible to find a character who had a complete science in botany, natural history, mineralogy, and astronomy, joined the firmness of constitution and character and prudence, habits adapted to the woods, and familiarity with the Indian manners and character requisite for making this undertaking. All the latter qualifications Captain Lewis has, unquote. Lewis chose Clark for his draftsman and frontiersman skills. The men that made up the expedition were all volunteers, chosen for their frontier and survival skills. They departed from the Falls of the Ohio on October the 26th, 1803. They would be gone for 3 years, returning with a vast collection of scientific information, maps, charts, and a trove of other information about the Louisiana Territory. Nearby, we find the George Rogers Clark home site, where William Clark lived with his also famous brother George. Revolutionary War hero George Rogers Clark settled on this beautiful spot overlooking the Ohio River. General Clark's fame came from his exploits during the winter of 1778, during which he captured the 3 British posts in the Illinois country, Vincennes, Cahokia, and Kaskaskia. This courageous expedition, composed of 175 men, took these posts without firing a shot, thus securing what would become the Northwest Territory from the British. Congress carved 6 states from this immense territory: Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Ohio. General Clark borrowed the money to fund the expedition. The United States government never properly compensated him for his exploits, and he spent most of his last days dealing with financial difficulties. For his services, the state of Virginia awarded Clark 150,000 acres called the Clark Grant. This grant makes up most of current Clark County. Clark built a cabin and grist mill on the spot occupied by the replica and lived there until 1809 when he had a stroke and fell into the fireplace, burning his leg. The leg needed amputation, so he could no longer operate the mill. He moved to live with his brother-in-law in Kentucky, dying in 1818 after suffering another stroke. The cabin on this spot is not the original cabin. There are no known drawings of that cabin, destroyed in 1854. This one comes from Ripley County, Indiana, near the town of Osgood. The state of Indiana moved it here in 2001. The smaller cabin on the site is also a replica of the cabin occupied by Clark's servants, the McGee family. Technically, slavery was illegal in the Northwest Territory, so many slaves that lived there became free when the Northwest Ordinance became law. Many, lacking money to buy land, signed indentured service agreements with their former masters. The masters granted freedom and a tract of land to them as a payment after the set period of servitude, sometimes. Interpretive panels describe the gathering of the Corps of Discovery. William Clark, George Rogers Clark's younger brother, occupied the cabin with his brother. He kept up a correspondence with the President Thomas Jefferson, with whom he and his brother George were friends. In 1803, he received a letter from the President requesting him to form up a company to explore the vast new acquisition, the Louisiana Territory, that Jefferson had purchased from France in 1803. The cabin thus became a staging point for the Corps of Discovery. The expedition, now known as the Lewis and Clark Expedition, launched on the nearby river. The Department of Natural Resources has erected several interpreted plaques outlining the beginnings of this voyage and the men that took part in it. Visitors during the time the park is open can browse the cabins and meander through the grounds. There are picnic tables allowing the visitor to gaze out over the waters of the Ohio as they enjoy their lunch. The area is ripe in history as the final home of the American Revolutionary War hero, sometimes called the Conqueror of the Northwest, General George Rogers Clark, and his famous brother William Clark, one of the leaders of the Lewis and Clark expedition. You can find the George Rogers Clark home site at 1102 West Harrison Avenue, Clarksville, Indiana. Another popular Jeffersonville attraction is the Colgate Clock. The Colgate Clock is the second largest timepiece in the world, exceeding London's Big Ben. Measuring 40 feet in diameter with hands of 16 and 20.5 feet respectively, the Colgate Clock has been a major southern Indiana landmark for nearly 7 decades. Since it was first illuminated on November the 17th, 1924, the Seth Thomas Company constructed the Colgate Clock. It faces the Ohio River and can be observed from Louisville, Kentucky. The clock is a movie star as it appears in the movie The Insider. Big Four Station Park, located near Colgate Clock at 1304 Mulberry Street in Jeffersonville, we find the Big Four walking bridge that leads to Louisville, Kentucky, across the Ohio River. The Big Four Railroad was formed on June 30th, 1889 by the merger of the Cleveland, Columbus, Cincinnati, and Indianapolis Railway, the Cincinnati, Indianapolis, St. Louis, and Chicago Rail Companies, the Indianapolis and St. Louis Railways, and the company bought the Indiana, Bloomington, and Western Railway in 1890, thus forming the Big Four. The New York Central acquired the line in 1906, but ran it as a separate entity until 1930. In 1925, the Big Four operated 2,391 route miles and 4,608 track miles. It carried 8,180 million tons of revenue of freight, 488 million passenger miles. In February 2011, Indiana and Kentucky commenced a joint venture to convert the former railroad bridge into a pedestrian bridge that connected the two cities. Constructed in 1895, the 6-span former railroad truss bridge carried trains of the Big Four Railroad across the river. The Kentucky side opened on February the 7th, 2013. A year later, the Jeffersonville ramp opened on May the 20th, 2014. The bridge connects the Waterfront Park in Louisville with Big Four Station Park in Jeffersonville. Hikers and bicyclists can enjoy scenic views of the Ohio River on the 1 mile long route. The northwest corner of Whitewater River Bridge and Campbell and State Streets across the railroad tracks on the south side of West Harrison, Indiana, in Dearborn County. From Lawrenceburg, take I-275 east towards I-74, then west towards Indianapolis. Use exit 3 and turn right on Harrison Avenue. At the intersection of State Harrison Avenue and State Street turn left. Campbell Road is less than a mile away on the left to the marker. Then note the location of the canal junction. Marker text, side 1, quote, "The Whitewater Canal and Cincinnati and Whitewater Canal joined in Harrison to provide a better access to the Cincinnati markets and the Ohio River. Indiana Internal Improvements Act 1836 authorized Whitewater Canal, completed from Brookville to Lawrenceburg 1839. Nearby Dam Number 1 on Whitewater River created a pool for canal boats to cross the river." Side 2, Cincinnati and Whitewater Canal incorporated by Ohio General Assembly 1837, completed 7 miles from Harrison, now West Harrison, Indiana, to Dry Fork Creek, Ohio, 1840. 25-mile canal opened in 1843 when 1,782-foot tunnel completed at Cleves, Ohio. Traffic diverted to Cincinnati on this interstate transportation link diminished Lawrenceburg's importance as a market. Unquote. Canals reigned supreme during the early part of the 19th century before the advent of railroads. They provided a cheap, fast means of transporting goods overland. They had grave disadvantages, though. They were expensive to build and maintain. It was only possible to construct them in favorable terrain. Indiana and Ohio both embarked on canal building programs and managed to link their systems here at the junction of the Cincinnati and Whitewater Canal and the Whitewater Canal. The Whitewater Canal's construction lasted from 1836 to 1847. During this time, there were many starts, pauses, as the state of Indiana ran out of money and various companies, private companies charged with competing, also ran into financial difficulties. After completion, it connected Hagerstown, Indiana with Cincinnati, Ohio, 76 miles to the south. The canal provided a quick, convenient way for farmers to transport their goods to market in the cities. Before the canal, a farmer would need several days' travel over deeply rutted roads to take his goods to Cincinnati. The canal proved a difficult construction project. It dropped 491 feet over the distance and needed 56 locks and 7 dams. Several aqueducts to carry the canal over waterways also needed construction. The canal operated until 1862. The Whitewater Valley Railroad runs a part of the canal as a tourist attraction between Connersville and Metamore, Indiana. The train runs alongside the canal, and at Metamore, visitors, well, they used to be able to ride a canal boat, but the canal boat's out of commission. There's talk they may recommission it, but hard to tell. Anyway, the town of Metamore has many small shops. The state of Indiana maintains an operating grist mill in the town. For more information, contact Whitewater Valley Railroad, 455 Market Street, Connersville, Indiana, 765-825-2054. Cincinnati and Whitewater Canal. When Indiana proposed building the Whitewater Canal, Cincinnati merchants persuaded a consortium of private investors and the state of Ohio to fund a spur to connect with it. This 14-mile spur was constructed between 1839 and 1843. It included a canal tunnel, one of the few constructed in the United States. The canal was eventually abandoned and had silted up over the years from flooding and disuse. The Indianapolis and Cincinnati Railroad purchased the canal in 1862 and used the canal towpath for a rail line. The tunnel, used for a time as a railroad tunnel, still exists as on the National Register of Historic Places. President William Henry Harrison owned part of the land the canal needed and donated some land towards it. He is buried on a ridge over the tunnel. The Ohio Historical Society has a historical marker near its northern portal. Next, I want to talk about another marker called the Wetzel Trace. Locations in Franklin County at the intersection of Main and Toner Streets, South Laurel. We find a marker noting an early road in Indiana, the Wetzel Trace. Marker text, quote, "Here, how Edward Toner founded Somerset, 1816, and operated Toner's Tavern, 1816 through 1823, from which rallying point pioneers started west on Jacob Wetzel's trace to the new purchase of central Indiana," unquote. A man named Jacob Wetzel cut a road through the forest beginning in 1818. Starting at Toner's Tavern in current Laurel, Indiana, the road cut into the lands of the new purchase of the central Indiana. Jacob Wetzel lived from September the 16th, 1765 until July the 2nd, 1827. Born near Wheeling Creek in West Virginia, Wetzel served in the Indian Wars in West Virginia and Ohio, fighting under Generals William Henry Harrison and Arthur St. Clair. After the wars, he and his son Cyrus and 4 other men hired to cut a trail through the forest. His grave is in McKenzie County in Morgan County. Mackenzie Cemetery in Morgan County. Edward Toner lived from April the 8th, 1783 until February the 18th, 1867. Born in Lycoming County, Pennsylvania, to a father who came from Somerset, Ireland during the Revolutionary years, Edward moved to Franklin County, Indiana. Toner and his wife settled in a town named Somerset, a town he founded and named for his father's Irish home. He established a tavern that served as a trailhead for Wetzler's Tavern. The lands acquired from the Miami by the terms of the treaty with the Miami in 1818, also called the Treaty of St. Mary's, are referred to as the New Purchase. Jonathan Jennings, Lewis Cass, and Benjamin Park, acting as representatives of the United States, signed a treaty with the Miami Nation on October the 6th, 1818. As per terms of the treaty, the Miami has ceded a large area in central Indiana to the United States. The United States agreed to pay the Miami tribe $15,000 a year, erect a grist mill, and one sawmill. They would also provide a blacksmith and pay 160 bushels of salt a year to the tribe. After the agreement was reached, Wetzler cut the trace into the new lands and founded a small settlement of his own. The intersection of US 52 and Little Cedar Road, north of the highway, 3 miles south of Brookville, Mount Haven, we find the Little Cedar Grove Baptist Church. Marker text, quote, built in 1812, this is the oldest church building still on its original location in the state. Interior shows rifle openings in walls, a balcony, and raised pulpit. Burial plot adjoins the church, unquote. When the New Madrid earthquake struck on December the 16th, 1811, the primitive Baptists that made up the congregation of a church organized in 1805 took it as a sign from God that he was displeased with them. When the aftershocks continued into 1812, the people became convinced of it. The church's founders were members of the William Tyner and Abraham Hackelman families. Historical evidence suggests that the men fought in the British Loyalist militia during the Revolutionary War. At war's end, the families were not welcome in their North Carolina community. The families first migrated to Scott County, Kentucky. From Kentucky, the families moved on to the Ohio Territory and established the First Baptist Church in Ohio. In 1805, they moved once again, this time to an area west of current Brookville, Indiana. They built a log church in 1805 and used that structure until the 1811 earthquake. The earthquake and the aftershocks frightened them, and they called a prayer meeting and vowed to build a proper church if God would send no more earthquakes. In 1812, they built the current church on the site of the original log church. They completed construction of this church on August 1st, 1812. A cemetery with the graves of many of the original settlers adjoins the church. Betsy Hackelman's grave, wife of Abraham Hackelman, is inside the church, the only grave still intact from the original cemetery. She had died in 1810. The Franklin County Historical Society now maintains the site and it is open to the public. Contact the Franklin County Historical Society, P.O. Box 342, Brookville, Indiana. In the lovely town of Oldenburg in Franklin County, we discover a marker noting an early school, the Academy of the Immaculate Conception, which still stands on the site. Marker text, quote, Sisters of Mary Frances, opened in 1852, enlarged in 1876 and 1901, the Academy Classroom Building and Auditorium were completed in 1968, unquote. From her home in Vienna, Austria, 24-year-old Mother Teresa Hackelmeyer traveled to the hills of Franklin County, Indiana, to settle at the town of Oldenburg. During the 9 years she ministered to the town, she would establish the Sisters of St. Francis in Oldenburg, a school, and care for orphans. German immigrants founded Oldenburg in Indiana in 1837, naming it after their native city in Germany. The first settler, William George, arrived with his brother in 1817. They blazed a trail across southeastern Indiana forests until they arrived at a site at East Harvey Branch Creek. They settled there for the next 20 years, little change other than the streets they felled to clear their fields. The flow of German immigrants from Germany increased during this time, and many found their way to the new community, guided by Father Joseph Fernerding. Father Fernerding was a traveling Catholic missionary that would cross the Ohio River and persuade German families to come to the developing town. Oldenburg was platted in 1837, with room left for the Catholic Church already under construction. The small log church was called St. Mary's and would form the nucleus of a growing Catholic population that would flavor the town with a unique German culture. The culture lingers into the 21st century. Father Francis Joseph Rudolph ministered at the Oldenburg Church and invited Sister Teresa Hackelmeyer to come to the community and establish a school to teach and care for the children. A cholera epidemic had ravaged the southeast Indiana in 1847, leaving many children as orphans. The young woman responded to the call and traveled alone across the ocean. She traveled from New York via the Erie Canal and the Ohio River. Father Rudolph met her at Lawrenceburg and brought her to Oldenburg. She opened her school in a one-room cabin at the base of the Oldenburg Hill. Three other young women soon joined her. These were Sister Michaela, Sister Teresa Dreer, and Mother Antonia. These women established a boarding school that housed 6 children and a school that taught 20. They also founded the Sisters of St. Francis of Oldenburg. The sisterhood established other schools throughout Indiana. The sisters traveled to other towns to teach, returned each spring to their Oldenburg base for spiritual retreat, and continue their training. By 1851, the sisters had taken full charge of the school, which had grown to include 20 children. The winter of 1851, the weather had become cold and snowy, and it was unsafe for the children to return to their homes on remote farmsteads. 5 of the children became the first boarding students at the school. The next year, the number of boarding students grew to 12. The tradition of boarding students continues to grow to this day. Madison in Jefferson County is one of Indiana's oldest cities. Visitors to this charming town will find a marker noting the Madison Historic District at Vaughn Drive and Jefferson Street in Riverside Walk, Madison. Marker text, quote, Madison Historic Church, listed in National Register, 1973, in over 130 blocks, contains hundreds of structures of every type, size, and period from 1812 through 1920. Including many outstanding examples of major 19th century architectural styles. Madison is significant in growth of Indiana historic preservation movement. Formed in 1860, Historic Madison Incorporated was a pioneer effort in the movement of small towns acting to preserve their historic heritage. Since Madison is one of the first communities in Indiana settled, the community possessed a rich heritage of historic buildings. The organization conducts many tours and events that present the history of Madison to interested visitors. In addition, Historic Madison features several historic buildings around the town, many of which are open to the public. The list of publicly open buildings includes the Ben Schroeder Saddle Tree Factory Museum, Costigan House, Dr. Hudging Office and Hospital. Also in Madison, at the intersection of 1001 West Main and McIntyre Streets, southwest corner of Railroad Bridge, we find what at one time was the steepest railroad incline in the United States. The marker there states, quote, built 1836 through 1841 as part of Indiana's 1836 Internal Improvement Act, measures 7.5 feet long and elevates 413 feet to achieve 5.89% grade. 500,000 tons of rock and earth were moved in construction, still considered to be the steepest standard gauge track ascended by wheel and engine locomotives in the United States, unquote. Construction on the incline and cut began on September the 16th, 1836. The project had its beginnings in the Internal Improvement Act of 1836, which authorized a massive internal works program. The completion of the cut took 5 years of hard labor by predominantly Irish laborers. The workers moved an estimated 500,000 tons of rock and earth. This included from 40 to 125 feet of limestone bedrock. The first train to ride up the incline was on November the 3rd, 1841. The steepness of the incline was too much for any railroad locomotive at the time, so trains had to be pulled up the incline by teams of horses. In an attempt to lessen the incline began in 1852. John Brough, president of the Madison and Indianapolis Railroad, proposed a new route that would enter the Clifty Creek Canyon west of Madison. It would descend on a less steep incline into Madison. The state of Indiana approved the project and Brough started construction. He believed the project would take 3 months. However, the terrain was difficult and required the construction of 2 tunnels plus a number of trestles. A year after construction began, the cost of the new route had run over by $115,000. The $300,000 project turned to a $415,000 project, and the money ran out. The M&I Railroad had to abandon the project. Visitors to the park can still see some of the trestles constructed during the 1850s for this rail line. They can see them on Trail 5 in the park, as well as they can see the tunnels on Trail 5 as well as some of the trestles. The railroad tried a number of special-built locomotives to handle the grade. They finally hit pay dirt with the Reuben Wells, constructed in 1868. It ran regular runs until 1898. After that, it served as a backup locomotive until 1903. On October the 25th, 1943, a locomotive went out of control and crashed downtown Madison. The engineer and conductor of the train were killed. The record train sent to clear the wreckageway also crashed. No one was hurt in that crash. The railroad still serves the Madison Port Authority on an as-needed basis. The Madison Heritage Railway Trail follows a portion of this railroad. 108 St. Michael's Avenue, Madison, Indiana, we find a historic site where you can spend a night or two enjoying the area, the Eagle Cotton Mill. Text of the marker, side 1, quote, "The Eagle Cotton Mill began production here in 1885, shipping goods such as twine, candlewick, and fabric via the Ohio River to national and international markets. After an economic downturn of the 1800s, the mill helped rejuvenate Madison's river commerce. A major city employer, its largely female workforce led to an 1889 strike for better working conditions." Side 2, local industrialist Richard Johnson and his family owned the mill from the 1890 until the 1930s. Meese Incorporated bought the site in 1940, producing canvas goods, World War II combat gear, and later plastic products before relocating in 1980. After decades of vacancy and failed redevelopments, the mill was renovated as a hotel in 2021, part of a national trend to revitalize national buildings. Unquote. Robert McKim, John Adams, Charles Cravens, James Harton, Charles A. Corbley, Charles Ailing, and S.M. Strader filed paperwork in 1882 to initiate the process of forming a corporation that they would call the Eagle Cotton Mills of Madison. They planned to build a cotton mill in Madison with a capacity of producing 11,000 yards of muslin cloth a year. After successfully forming their company, the board of directors next began negotiations to purchase the Eagle and Banner Cotton Mill located in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. This company had been in Pittsburgh for almost 50 years. By 1884, the purchase had been completed, and the men began finalizing their plans to construct their factory in Madison. They hoped to draw many of the skilled workers at Pittsburgh plant to Madison, as well as employ hundreds of Madison residents. The city of Madison agreed to sell the company a tract of land that served as a city's gravel pit between the Church and Baltimore streets. They awarded a contract to construct a 4-story, 247 by 74-foot building in 90 days. The 3 lower stories were to be 12 feet high and the 14th floor 14 feet high. The construction project would also include a 3-story picker house, an engine house, boiler house. The J.M.I. Railroad Company laid a switch line to the mill, and Edison Electric Light Company of New York City, and installed 312 electric lights. The mill began operations with 300 employees on March 1, 1885. The picker house was the first destination for cotton bales delivered to a mill for processing. After the cotton arrived, workers separated the bugs, twigs, leaves, and other debris from the cotton. After cleaning it, they fed the cotton into a machine called a breaker lapper, which stretched the cotton to clean it and form it into loose cotton sheets called laps. The process created a great deal of dust, which was a fire hazard. For this reason, the picker house was located some distance away from the mill. The boiler house contained huge furnaces that workers shoveled coal into to produce a fire that boiled huge boilers filled with water to produce steam that was piped to areas in the mill for heating. The engine house had a large steam engine and powered the looms and other machinery in the plant. Working conditions in the plant were harsh, as workers toiled 11.5 hours per day, 6 days a week. Workers went on strike in 1889, demanding a 10-hour workday. They received an 11-hour workday with a 45-minute lunch break. Saturdays were reduced to 9 hours with a 45-minute lunch break. Steamboats docked at the mill's wharf to unload cotton bales and other raw materials and to load finished products. Director sold the plant to Richard Johnson in 1891. Johnson installed new equipment in 1892 and operated it until 1909 when he passed away. Johnson also owned the Riverside Starch Works. He closed this and established the Johnson Cordage Company in that building. In 1917, the cordage factory burned, and Johnson's son, who now ran the company, moved the cordage works into the cotton mill. These mill and cordage works operated in the same building until closing in the late 1930s. Since the building contained more floor space than the mill and cordage factory needed, the company leased the top floor to the Longini Shoe Company. A business consortium led by Edwin Meese purchased the building and moved their business into it. This company produced canvas mail carts, laundry carts, and ice cream parts, and canvas shipping containers, as well as other canvas products. Meese operated this business in the building until moving it to another location in the early 1980s. The building, now vacant, changed owners several times over the decade and was the subject of many different renovation plans. All of these plans failed until Riverton LLC, the City of Madison, and the Indiana Economic Development Corporation concluded a plan to turn the property into a boutique hotel. The project broke ground in 2019, and the 85-room hotel opened in June 2021. Historic Cotton Mill is it's called the Historic Cotton Mill Fairfield by Marriott Inn and Suites, and it's at 10108 St. Michael's Avenue, Madison, Indiana. You can call them at 812-274-5900. In Ripley County, we find a marker at the intersection of U.S. Route 50 and Old Michigan Road that notes the importance of Indiana's first superhighway. The marker text, quote, extending from Michigan City to the Ohio River at Madison, begun by the state in 1832 with funds obtained from the sale of land generated by the Potawatomi Indians, opened the northern part of the state to settlers, unquote. The Michigan Road is one of the oldest roads in Indiana, built in the early 1800s to connect Madison, Indiana with Michigan City. When the Indiana state government moved from Corydon, Indiana to Indianapolis, the legislatures and governor found themselves in isolation. There were no good roads leading to the new capital city, and the White River was not navigable. They sought to rectify this by passing legislation to build the first, quote, superhighway in the state of Indiana. To accomplish their goal, they needed to negotiate a treaty with the Potawatomi Indian tribe and clear a vast swath of trees the length of the state. The first settlers began populating the site, now known as Madison, Indiana, around 1806. The town was incorporated in 1809, 7 years before Indiana became a state. Its location along the Ohio River caused it to become an important town in the state's early state's history. In 1836, the Madison-Indianapolis Railroad was completed, connecting the growing city with the new state capital. The state's first major highway was the Michigan Road, commissioned in 1828. Construction began in 1830, and the road was completed in 1837. The Michigan Road, later become Indiana State Road 29, ran from Madison, Indiana to Michigan City on Lake Michigan in the north. It ran through Indianapolis, connecting the state capital to the Ohio River and to Lake Michigan. So by the 1840s, Madison was connected to the northern part of the state by road and rail. Over half of the pioneers settling Indiana passed along this road, and this influx of traffic allowed Madison to grow. Competing railroads caused the railroad to fail, and other routes opened up, causing Madison, Indiana to fall in importance while other cities grew. The population maintained itself from the Civil War until the late 1900s. A program of downtown renewal has resulted in the creation of a vibrant small city along the banks of the Ohio River. The historic downtown has been revitalized, a riverwalk built along the river, and there are exciting events all year, making Madison a picturesque and inviting town to visit. The need for a good harbor on Lake Michigan spurred the development of Michigan City. A real estate developer named Isaac C. Elston purchased 200 acres along the lakeshore in 1830. He recorded the plat in 1833. Michigan City incorporated in 1836. The completion of the Michigan Road in 1837 connected the growing city with Indianapolis and the Ohio River far to the south. The planned route of the roads lay in land still claimed by the Potawatomi Indian tribe, which owns several hundred still lived in the state. To complete the road, the state needed to conclude a treaty with the tribe. The tribe and the state concluded this treaty on October the 16th, 1826. By terms of the treaty, the tribe conceded a strip of land 100 feet wide through their lands. The legislation called for a road 100 feet wide with a center 30 feet to be free of stumps. The state contracted 1 mile long increments of the road to the lowest bidder. The first 15 miles of the road leading from Madison took over a year to build. The road traveled north from Madison to Napoleon, Indiana, and then on to Indianapolis. Indiana State Road 29 followed much of the old route, which today has been superseded by other highways and roads. U.S. Route 421 north of Madison follows some of the route of this early highway, and a section along Big Oaks National Wildlife Refuge follows the original route of this early historic road as it worked its way north. It begins at an intersection with US 421 about 1 mile north of the Jefferson County line. A Morgan's Raid marker is just off to the left as the road begins. For the first 5 miles, Big Oaks National Wildlife Refuge borders the west side of the road. Michigan Road crosses US 50 about 10.5 miles from its inception on US 421. Michigan Road ends 8.8 miles north of US 50 at an intersection just south of Napoleon, Indiana. As it turns just near the northern end, the original route of the road may be seen along the western edge of the cemetery. From Napoleon, the old road follows US 421 to Logansport. From there, State Road 25 follows the original route to Rochester, Indiana. US 31 followed the original route from Rochester to South Bend. State Road 2 and US 20 followed the original route or close to it from South Bend to Michigan City. Short sections still exist in Indianapolis and at other places around the state. Michigan Road was an important early conduit of travel and commerce in the state of Indiana. Its early history in it still exists in short sections. Another section survives in Decatur and Shelby counties, as well as other areas. Scott County, we find a marker at 1050 South Main Street, Scottsburg, that notes the location of the Scott County home. Marker text, side 1, quote, Indiana law in 1831 authorized counties to establish institutions to support and accommodate the poor, carrying out the 1816 Constitution provision. First Scott County home built 1861 north of Lexington, closed 1879. County home moved here to frame house on 180 acres. Residents of such asylums could farm and help support the facilities. Side 2. The brick structure replaced the frame house in 1892. Over time, acreage was reduced. Structure ceased to function as a county home in 1973. Scott County Public Services and government offices located here until 1995, listed in the National Register of Historic Places in 2000. Property named home of Scott County Heritage Center and Museum 2001. Currently the home of Scott County Heritage Center and Museum, the county home, or poor farms, as the facilities came to be known, served an important purpose during the times of their use. People who had no family to care for them came to live at the poor farm. These were usually elderly folks who needed a place to live. However, younger people could live there too. People living there had a task assigned to them on the working, self-sufficient farms. For more information about the home or Scott County, contact Scott County Heritage Center and Home, 1050 South Main Street, Scottsburg, Indiana, 812-752-1050. North side of Scottsburg, we find Lake Iola, an urban site on the east shore of Lake Iola, William H. Graham Park, North Bond Street, Scottsburg. Marker text, side 1, quote, Indianapolis and Louisville Traction Company organized to build the track between Seymour and Sellersburg as part of the interurban line which extended from Indianapolis to Louisville track, completed in 1907. First railway in the country to operate on 1200-volt high-tension direct current system powered by generators at this site. Side 2, car barn and water tower also built on site. Artificial lake later named Lake Iola, created as water source for power equipment. Indiana Railroad abandoned operation. Last train on October the 31st, 1939. Building foundations and some track remain. Land around Lake Iola is now property of Scottsburg, serving as a park and interpretive center. End quote. The interurban rail lines of the late 19th and early 20th century provided the first mass transit system connecting rural areas with the cities. In the era before the automobile and paved highways, the interurban lines provided fast, cheap transportation across not just Indiana, but the nation as well. The interurban railways rose in the late 1880s and reached their prominence by 1925. The rise of the automobile and paved highways started their demise. An interurban was a rail line that used electricity for power and operated between cities. The 1905 census definition was, quote, a street railway having more than half its trackage outside the municipal limits, unquote. This definition separated an interurban from suburban railroads. Indiana State Senator Charles H. Henry coined the term interurban at the World's Fair in Chicago in 1893 while attending a convention. Construction of the track, which paralleled Pennsylvania Railroad tracks, began in 1895. Completion of the final link between Sellersburg and Seymour, Indiana occurred in 1907. The rail line offered quick transportation between Louisville and Indianapolis, about 3 hours from downtown to downtown. Trains bound south were dubbed Dixie Flyer and the northbound train Hoosier Flyer. The interurban made several stops along the way. Passenger traffic provided the main revenue, but the train also transported freight. During strawberry time, strawberry specials took fresh strawberries from Floyd County to Indianapolis and Louisville. The train line had special cattle cars that took cattle directly to the stockyards in downtown Louisville. The line was active until October the 31st, 1939, when the last train ran. The historical marker is at William H. Graham Park in Lake Iola on the northwestern side of Scottsburg. The park has a walking trail around Lake Iola, picnic shelters, and restroom facilities. Visitors will also find a train car parked in the pavilion on display in the park. Quote, the town of Marshfield, Indiana was the site of one of the earliest recorded train robberies in the United States. The locally famous Reno gang pulled off the robbery that proved to be the last criminal act by the gang. Platted on May the 22nd, 1857, the founders named the town after Marshfield, Massachusetts. The post office opened on April the 6th, 1857, and remained until 1989. By the 1860s, the town had grown to include a dry goods store, a hotel, 3 churches, 3 saloons, 2 blacksmith shops, a grain warehouse, a wagon and carriage factory, a grocery store, drugstore, and 3 physicians. The Jeffersonville, Madison, and Indianapolis Railroad used it as a water stop. The locomotives of that era needed to stop to replenish the water in their boilers every few miles to keep going. The now abandoned town is on US 31, about 3 miles north of Scottsburg, Indiana. The Reno gang operated primarily in the southern Indiana countryside in and around Jackson County. Their repertoire of crime included robbery, arson, bribery, murder, and burglary. Their train robbing activities provided a primer for later Western outlaws like the James Gang. James Reno moved into Indiana from Kentucky in 1813, locating near the small town of Rockford, Indiana. His son Wilkinson Reno married Julia Ann and had 5 sons and 1 daughter. Frank was the oldest, born in 1837, followed by John in 1838. Simon in 1843, Clinton in 1847, William in 1848, and Laura in 1851. The only sibling not involved in the gang was Clint. The parents tried to instill a righteous upbringing by requiring the children to study the Bible for hours at a time on Sunday. 4 of the sons rebelled, as well as Laura. Their criminal activity began with card games they would play with travelers along the road. The children cheated and hoodwinked travelers out of their money. The activity soon expanded to arson in 1851, when several businesses in Rockford were burned. Everyone suspected the Renos, but no one ever filed charges. When the Civil War began, the Renos discovered the art of bounty jumping. They would enlist in an army unit, collect the bounty, and then desert. Before the end of the war, the Renos had recruited other outlaws to come into the area. Using a hotel called the Radar House as a headquarters, the gang planned their criminal activities, which included post office robberies, burglaries, and arson. The authorities arrested them several times, but witnesses never came forward for fear of their lives, so they were always released. There was a cause for the witnesses' fear because many who did threaten to testify were murdered. Jackson County had become a nest of crime, with county officials either accepting bribes or intimidated into inactivity. A precursor of their famous train robbery occurred on October the 6th, 1866, when 3 members of the gang boarded an Ohio and Mississippi train. After the train started, the gang members forced their way into the Adams Express Company car and forced the messenger inside to surrender his keys. The gang members opened a safe, stole the cash and gold inside. They rolled one safe off the track, rolled one safe off the back of the train, and pulled a signal rope. The engineer stopped the train. The gang members then pulled the rope again, signaling the all clear message to the engineer. As the train pulled away, the gang made off with the loot. They were unable to open the safe that they had rolled off the back. The Marshfield train robbery served as a model for the James Gang and those that came after. It occurred on May the 22nd, 1868. The train had left Jeffersonville, Indiana, and reached Marshfield around 11 p.m. Train gang members moved out of the darkness and overpowered the train crew. They uncoupled the train from the locomotive, leaving only the Adams Express coupled to the locomotive. They took the train on towards, ordering the engineer to proceed at gunpoint. The train continued to Seymour while the outlaws ransacked the car. The messenger resisted, and they threw him from the speeding train. The messenger survived, though badly hurt. Their efforts paid off when the outlaws found $96,000 in U.S. government bond, cash, and gold. They ordered the engineer to stop in a valley of the Muscatatuck River where other gang members waited with horses. After dividing the loot, the gang took off into darkness. Over time, most of the Reno brothers were apprehended. A band of vigilantes in Jeffersonville hanged them on December the 12th, 1868, as they awaited trial. Legend has it that there is $96,000 in gold, cash, and securities still buried somewhere in Jackson County, as the gang members never divulged where they stashed the loot. Last destination is the Pigeon Roost Massacre Site at the entrance to Pigeon Roost State Historic Site, US 31, 5 miles south of Scottsburg, in Scott County. Marker text, quote, Side 1. Pigeon Roost, settled 1809 in Clark County, was attacked on September the 3rd, 1812. Over 20 settlers and an unknown number of Indians were killed. Clark County militia unsuccessfully pursued the remaining Indians. That same month, Fort Harrison and Fort Wayne were attacked by Indians. The U.S. had declared war on Great Britain June the 18th, 1812. Side 2. Pigeon Roost Raid was part of an ongoing conflict between Indians influenced by British and settlers along the frontier, one of the contributing factors to the War of 1812 in the West. The state of Indiana appropriated $2,000 for the construction of the memorial here, dedicated October the 1st, 1904. The site became a state historic site in 1929. Quote, "For many reasons for the American declaration of war on Great Britain on June the 18th, 1812. The most important ones were Britain's habit of stopping United States ships on the high seas and impressing sailors into the Royal Navy and other humiliations of U.S. ships. Trade restrictions imposed on the United States by Great Britain during the war with France were another reason. Britain also threatened American western expansion by encouraging the native tribes to attack settlers moving into the new areas. They encouraged the attacks by offering bounties on any scalps a native brought to a British outpost. The attack at Pigeon Roost was in response to this bounty system. William E. Collings, who lived from 1758 until 1828, established the village of Pigeon Roost in 1809. The settlement was in land still claimed by the Shawnee. There was an Amerindian village a few miles from the settlement. Most of the settlers came from Kentucky. The village consisted of a line of cabins along the mud road leading from Vienna to Henryville. Vienna and Henryville were the closest blockhouses to Pigeon Roost. The settlers chose the name Pigeon Roost because large numbers of passenger pigeons inhabited the area. Few men remained in Pigeon Roost at the time of the attack, as most were at Vincennes with William Henry Harrison's force there. The war party consisted mostly of Shawnees, but some Potawatomi and Delaware were probably in it as well. Legend says they crossed the White River near Sparksville and proceeded through Vienna without attacking it. There are stories of bad blood between the Collings family and the Shawnee, and that is why the natives chose Pigeon Roost. The first settler to set something was wrong was Jeremiah Payne of Vienna. Upon investigating his cattle lowing, discovered arrows protruding from several of them. He rode to his cabin and took his wife and children to Vienna's blockhouse, then sped to Pigeon Roost to spread the warning to his brother Elias. Upon arrival at his brother's cabin, he discovered the dead and scalped bodies of his sister-in-law and their 7 children. Elias and a neighbor had been scouring the forest, searching for bee trees and the honey they offered. The attackers went on through the settlement, burning cabins and killing and scalping anyone they encountered. Many of the settlers managed to escape to the blockhouse at Henryville, but not before the warriors killed over 20 settlers. The survivors buried most of the victims in a mass grave near the site. Militia units located in Charlestown heard of the attack and set off in pursuit of the war party. They lost a trail near the Muscatatuck River. A band of Indiana Rangers from Washington County, led by Captain Henry DeWalt, intercepted them at Sand Creek in Bartholomew County. They engaged the party but failed to stop their escape. Scott County maintains a site, a former Indiana State Historic Site. Indiana turned the facility over to Scott County. Scott County has built a log cabin on the site similar to the cabins that would have been there in 2014. The state of Indiana erected a limestone memorial to the victims in 1904. The memorial is on US 31 just south of Scottsburg, Indiana. Find out more about these Indiana day trip destinations and many more by purchasing the book Southeast Indiana Day Trips. The book includes location information as well as information on state parks, nature preserves, golf courses, wineries, breweries, and much, much more. You can find it on my website, www.mossyfeetbooks.com, on the Road Trip to Indiana category. Just scroll down the categories, click the Road Trip Indiana series. There are links to Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Google Play, and other online book retailers. You may choose to purchase the book in ebook or softbound versions. An audiobook version is also available on Google Play. There will be one more podcast in this series covering the courthouses of southeastern Indiana. At the conclusion of this series, I will compile the episodes into an audiobook. The next series will cover Indiana's role in the Civil War. Listeners may also be interested in my book, The Ultimate Day Trip Travel Guide. The 747-page book includes a plethora of day trip destinations in Indiana, a complete tourism guide. The book includes local and state parks, museums, golf courses, and much, much more. The book includes information on all of Indiana's 92 counties. No traveler in Indiana should be without it. You can also order books direct from me, the author, on the webpage. If you wish me to sign the book, just send me an email to mossyfeetbooks@gmail.com requesting a signed book and instructions on how you want me to address it. Note, if you send me an email, I will add you to my contact list. Readers on the list will receive an email from me announcing when I publish a new book. If you do not want me to add you to the list, tell me and I will not add you. Listeners to this podcast that want email notifications of my books, of my new releases, can just send me an email requesting addition to the list. You can choose to have your name removed at any time. If you browse the website, you will find dozens of sample chapters, one for each of my book, and there's over 130 books up there. If you visit my YouTube channel, at the Mossy Feet Books YouTube channel, you can see videos that I've compiled of these books, of these podcasts, using a lot of the photographs and things that I've taken from around the area over the years. I hope you enjoyed this podcast, and thank you for listening.